some instances. I alluded to a couple of these in particular last night when I was talking about some of the reviews that I was writing. I reviewed. I saw people using a laser. No. That's not my heartbeat. This one was the book that was published by the University of Chicago Press by Joshua Blues, and this one was the one by Michael McLeod, Anatomy of the Beast. And there's just a lot of very poor scholarship, poor journalism. There's just no other way to describe the nature of these books, and the motivation of the two authors is, like I said, it's just inexplicable. I don't understand. When Booz, has anyone read this, by the way? This one, or obtained it? When Booz, in his introduction, he notes that he had previously written a book about fire ants, the threat of fire ants to the Southwest, and he said, in order to write this book, I had to learn a lot of biology, and it was really hard. It was a lot of work, but the book was better as a result. He said that for my next project, I decided that was too much work, so what would be more perfect than to write about something that doesn't exist? So I'll write a book about Bigfoot, and then it won't have to deal with any of the biology or any of the science. In this one, he is a journalist, producer, writer, who's done several documentaries. He doesn't really state explicitly anywhere what motivated him. He had some encounter with the subject some 4 or 5 years ago and decided to write a book about it. And it's basically, he says, obsession and myth on the trail of Bigfoot, anatomy of the beast. The only thing I can figure is that the beast he's talking about is obsession, because there's no anatomy, there's no science, there's very little discussion about Bigfoot. It's a biographical sort of kiss and tell kind of thing where he goes around and interviews several people, and he dresses it up with all sorts of flowery, prosaic descriptions of geographical trivia and historical trivia, which if he had diverted that attention and energy to actually researching the subject he was writing about, would have been a much better use of his time. I don't usually talk this critically about people, but these two books have gotten me so worked up here recently. So to counter some of this misinformation that's being continually perpetuated and just accepted to the point that it's becoming cliche almost in some people's minds, and to counter some other assertions that have been made, even a few that were made here tonight in a respectful, collegial, professional way, I'm going to review some of the insights that we've gained about the Patterson-Gimlin film. And I say review because this isn't just my evaluation. These are the opinions that have been arrived at by a number of varied researchers, and I'll draw upon their expertise as well as my own findings and observations. This is mostly, I'm not going to address the issues of the timeline or the context of the film. I'll make a couple of comments about some other things that have been said, just to offer you another point of view tonight. But I'm mostly going to focus on the film subject itself and just look at it from the ground up. So starting with the footprints, for a long time people criticized that there was no direct evidence that the footprints documented at the Bluff Creek film site were actually laid down by the film subject, and leaving open the allegation, or the insinuation rather, that the footprints could have been fabricated separately or masterminded in some other way to avoid the very obvious challenges of creating footprints that would sink an inch and a half into this sandy substrate by an actor wearing oversized, artificial, otherwise inflexible feet. Well, there was this, quote, second roll of film. Roger had been shooting panoramic shots, scenery shots throughout the trip, and as it happened, at the moment that they encountered the Sasquatch, he had just a very little bit of film left on the roll. Thankfully, had just enough, it seemed. And then after running that film out, he quickly went under a poncho. He had to actually change out the film by hand and in as much dark as he could create to avoid exposing the film. And then a second roll of film was loaded into the camera, which he then used to film some of the footprints, including the couple that he cast, one of which is seen here. Yvonne Leclerc has taken some of the shots, the individual shots from that piece of film, and then laced them together to create something of a panorama. Now, there's the potential for a little bit of distortion. As you can imagine, these are not, these are shots that were taken walking along above the footprints. But nevertheless, it shows a very clear indication of the footprints at the film site, and shows, in fact, can mention here some with some interesting details, including a pressure release ridge or disc that's evident very plainly here. Actually, a very good example of that. M.K. Davis did some good work early on, in which he identified some features through some scrutiny of the film. And one is depicted in this little clip that was shown on National Geographic, and you can see right there, he showed that in that wildly gyrating early segment of the film, there actually were some frames that showed the footprints going up that steep edge of the sandbar. The sandbar itself stood about 34, 36 inches above the creek itself. So it was quite a substantial bed of sand. And apparently the film subject had crossed the creek ahead of Roger and Bob, and then walked up, stepped up in a couple of steps up the side of that steep embankment that Roger actually ran into when he ran across the creek and dropped him, which dropped him to his knees, and that's where the film stabilizes. All right, so that's kind of interesting. Most of the other things that M.K. Davis sees in the film are open to a tremendous amount of doubt and question. His allegations of a braid and a bun and a bullet hole and a pool of blood and arms sticking out through the gravel and etc. Are almost certainly artifacts of his extreme manipulation of the images. I have to correct, with all due respect, David, the frames that he showed and asserted were shown for the first time in the public were shown by M.K. Davis in Ohio just a few months ago. A few months ago? Was it a year ago? I've lost track now when I spoke in Ohio. The last time I was in Ohio, M.K. Davis presented those frames, and you notice they had kind of an off tint, off reddish tint, that took on tremendous significance in his mind, and creek water turned into pools of blood. And I just don't know what else to, won't go into any more detail other than to say that the allegations of massacre and mass burial at Bluff Creek are grossly exaggerated, don't represent the facts whatsoever. And his rendition of events which led to his conclusions are open to suspicion as well, based on testimony of other people. All right, I don't mean to be mysterious about that. It's just, oh, that's an interesting picture. That's Lyle Laverty. Computer didn't like that. Lyle Laverty was on the scene, examined the footprints the Monday following the filming on Friday afternoon. Word was got around in town over the weekend that something was up and that something had been seen at Bluff Creek. Lyle was actually camped not too far from that, from Lyle's camp, with a summer crew doing timber cruising, doing survey work. There had been in the previous years a ravaging flood that had scoured out that canyon, which was the reason for the large open space on the Bluff Creek sandbar. And there was salvage timber operation going on. A road had been put in up along the creek in order to access that. And so he was able to drive right up to the side. He knew from the description roughly where it would be. They went and looked. I spoke on the phone with Lyle Louderby at great length and quizzed him about what his recollection of the circumstances was. And he said, well, it was just like it's always been described. There was this long line of extremely clear, crisp footprints in the sandbar. And they had held their shape despite the rains that Bob describes in the night before they made a hasty exit before the road became inundated, because that sandbar has a particular kind of a grain structure to it. It's this sort of a decomposing shale that is very angular instead of rounded like a quartz sand would be. If it was a dry quartz sand that you'd stepped in, that Sasquatch just stepped in, the dry sand would very readily slump back in and it would lose its shape and details very quickly. But it wasn't. It was very angular, and I had a sample of that sand analyzed and described in technical terms by a physical geologist, and that description is in the well, the reprints are all gone now, but the reprints that some of you may have gotten copies of that describe these footprints as the type specimens for the ichnotaxon. He noted that it was fortunate that the sand had this quality because it held the shape. It would hold the shape of the footprint very well, even through a heavy rain. And so when Bob Titmus came to the scene 10 days later, after that heavy rain, the tracks were still very, very evident. And he was able to make casts of 10 tracks in succession that still held their shape and their form very well, showing some damage from the rain. But Lyle said all he saw was the long line, a single line of enormous tracks, and then horse hoof prints and boot prints from obviously some activity of what was Bob and Roger photographing and testing the firmness of the soil and making the casts. So here Lyle snapped off pictures of several of these, and even more fortunate, they were amongst the ones that were cast subsequently by Bob Titmus. So we have the photograph and a well-preserved cast, the original of which is down in the Willow Creek Museum. They've been scanned in high resolution, are now in the archive that I'm assembling. Here's another one. This one shows a nice pressure ridge here in the middle. Wide one. This one has the pressure disc where it's the sand is kind of fractured, not just humped up, but fractured back into the footprint. And finally, this very famous one that has been depicted in a number of places and featured prominently in my analysis, that shows a very distinct pressure ridge that can be seen here. Here are the scans of all 10 of Bob Titmus's casts. Here's the one exhibiting the most distinct pressure ridge. But you can see their clarity is held up pretty good, considering that this is in dry sand. The agreement with those casts, so here's one of those 10, is with the foot that is evident on the film subject, whatever it is without question. I mean, the blow up here from this early frame in the film, shows the detail of the toes, the individual toe pads, and the toe stems. The contours, the three-dimensional contours are quite clear and match up without any question with those of the footprints. And so, as I said, the footprints do take on a very tremendous amount of significance. And to emphasize that significance, when I undertook to name the footprints, to give them a name based on the conventions of ichnotaxonomy. It's a system of nomenclature devised in order to allow paleontologists to name fossilized footprints for which the skeletons of those track makers were not yet recognized or known. So they could talk about them in an intelligent way with a formalized label or handle. Applying that to the Sasquatch tracks that exist for which we don't know the track maker per se, at least not recognized formally. This is the name that I arrived at, Anthropoidopes ameriborealis, which just simply means North American 8-foot. And the type specimens are the right and left that were cast by Roger at the site, and referred to that material are the 10 tracks that were cast by Bob Titmus. Molds and replicas of those casts are housed at the Smithsonian, and then the original 10 Titmus casts are housed in the Willow Creek Museum. So we've met that criteria. There'll be specimens, the type specimens, or at least facsimiles of the type specimens, be housed at an accredited institution. And this article passed muster with 5 peer reviewers from the discipline of ichnotaxonomy. These are paleontologists whose specialty is the interpretation, the analysis, and description of fossil footprints of various types, from dinosaurs through mammals, Mesozoic and through Pleistocene mammals. Received very positively. So it was a huge step forward in recognition by this arena, published in the Bulletin of the New Mexico Museum of Natural History, a symposium volume on Cenozoic tracks and traces. So anytime anyone has a question about the state-of-the-art of Cenozoic tracks, they'll refer to this reference, and in thumbing through it, bingo, they'll hit a paper about Sasquatch tracks as well, another Cenozoic mammal. So it's really quite good. All right, I talked a lot about the metatarsal break last time. Is there anybody here that wasn't here last night? Oh, a few of you were, okay. Well, quickly, the prehensile versus propulsive division of the foot marks the adaptation of great apes, which are characterized by grasp climbing adaptation. They hold the substrate with the forepart of the foot. The calcaneus acts as the lever, and so there's some degree of decoupling there between those two. This is where that joint is. It's not an extra joint or a different joint. It's just the joint has a greater range of motion in the apes versus the humans. It's actually a compound joint between 4 bones, 2 pairs of bones, the talus and the navicular. So right there's half of it, and there's the calcaneus and the cuboid. Here it is in the chimp, right across there. And you can see right off the bat, hopefully, the extension of this surface right here along the ankle bone, the talus, TA. That indicates a much greater range of motion where the navicular can ride clear up onto that surface of the joint. In humans, it's much more restricted. So you can imagine if this bone is riding upward, that means that the foot is bending in that direction, or twisting in that direction. All right. So, as I mentioned before, it is now becoming accepted. Finally, I've been saying this along with a couple other voices, for about 10 years now, that the earliest human ancestors that were bipedal exhibited, in fact, evidence of a transverse tarsal joint that had a much greater range of motion than found in modern humans. And that even though they were walking on 2 legs, even though they had a greatly reduced degree of divergence of their big toe, these early hominids walked on flat, flexible feet. And they did it for millions of years. If the evolution of bipedalism originated as early as 7 million years, this species alone was practicing it for 4.5 million years. And we're doing just fine at it. So the objection that there's no precedent for my description of the Sasquatch foot walking on a flat, flexible foot doesn't have any footing, so to speak. So here's just another piece of evidence. I had pointed out repeatedly that in the published photographs of some of these tracks, there was this unusual ridge right here. And they said, the people who were from the site, who had excavated it themselves, said, oh, well, it's just a termite burrow. these subterranean termites are burrowing through the ash and they just went through the track. I says, well, yes, we have a line of alternating tracks running north and south, and these burrows then all running east and west, and they independently happen to intersect about a half dozen of the tracks at precisely the same point along the track's length. So that seems a little odd, doesn't it? Well, yeah, but well, maybe it's just excavation artifact. There was someone recently who commented that Tim White, when asked about this, would simply say that it was Mary Leakey with going crazy with her hammer and chisel and exfoliating a layer of the ash. I'm losing my life here, and creating a little ridge there. Well, I went down and I visited with Tim White, and he had in his possession, amongst other photographs and materials related to the footprints, a series of several molds, or casts rather, of the footprint. And this one was the $1 million mold right here, because right here is an extrusion front. It's just the rounded lip. There's no chance this is from fractured strata from poor excavation technique. This is the contact surface. This is an extrusion where the wet gloppy ash pressed out from under the forepart of the foot. Its edge, its leading edge, is identical to several examples where the ash squoze up between the first and second toes and then dropped over under its own weight, and has the same kind of rounded contour and surface. Now, I've used the yellow lines here to simply indicate the points of correlation here between the deepest point of the heel and between the deepest point of the big toe. So you can see that this is just up above here is just extraneous the glop of ash that plopped there. But the agreement in the position of that joint is really good. Anyway, the short of it is simply this. It's now very evident, and it's becoming more and more accepted, that early hominids were walking with flat, flexible feet. I showed this at the American Association of Physical Anthropology meetings, and turned a number of heads with this. It's basically a negative, and if you stare at it enough, it may bounce back and forth to negative and positive. It's a positive. It's a scan of one of the Laetoli tracks that has been turned into a positive so that it's sticking out at you. So it gives you a little more sense of what the shape of the foot was like that filled that track. Now, there's clearly some slide in and so forth, but you can see the deepest point of the heel. So it has this very tapered heel. But the important point is this feature right here, that can be seen as the deepest point right here. This foot is flexed across the midfoot. Now, not up with creating a pressure ridge, but it's flexed in the other direction, which is just the reciprocal of the same range of motion that joint can show in an ape-like foot. It's not an arch because it goes all the way across. There is no lateral column edge of the foot sinking in differentially deeper. Okay. Now, what really has kind of turned the corner on this whole discussion has been the discovery of the hobbit, Homo floresiensis. And here, this is one of my old professors actually at Stony Brook. He's heading up the description of the foot skeleton of this diminutive hominid. And instead of discussions about it being some sort of primitive human, it's now being considered a very primitive hominid, and having, if having affinities to any hominid, the one it's most closely allied with seems to be the Australopithecines. Much more primitive than anything approaching Homo. It has feet relative to its lower leg that are much, much longer than any human population. And it has feet that have a flexible midfoot with a very high range of motion of the transverse tarsal joint. So in the press releases and the popular articles that have been published, they're describing this thing as walking like a chimpanzee, walking on flat, flexible feet, and yet its pelvis and its hips and its spine are clearly adapted for bipedalism. So if this is true, if this has been derived from an Australopithecine from some age, then again, we've got flat, flexible feet, serving a hominid very well for at least, well, now we're up to 7, 8, 9 million years. So again, the notion of a giant hominid walking on legs. Now, here's one of the disinformations that I want to counter. Dr. David Daglin, a former colleague of mine, former fellow student of mine, and for some reason there's some rumor that we were roommates in college, and that's not true. We were lab mates, classmates rather, in college. He was in the doctoral program in anthropological sciences, and I was in the doctoral program in anatomical sciences. Across the way, but we had many courses together. We graduated within about a year of one another. I was looking at feet, he was looking at jaws, looking at the jaw mechanics of primates. But he's taken an interest in Sasquatch as an exercise in critical thinking and objectivity and anti-pseudoscience, etc., etc. And in his book, he publishes this picture. He took exception to my interpretation of the mid-tarsal break and the pressure ridge evident in the Sasquatch footprints, and said, oh, any human footprint will show that. If you just walk barefoot in the sand, here you go. Here's your pressure ridge. Well, he needs to stick with the jaws. He doesn't know feet. And this simply just isn't equivalent. And I don't think I show, no, go back one. Would have one for me, just push the arrow button. No, okay. It's just right here. You can see that this is a pressure release disc, but where does it begin? Not back here behind the transverse tarsal joint, but right here is where it starts. Here's where the material's humping up, and you can see the break here, creating a disc that displaces the sand back this way. But the point of the pressure release is focused right here at the ball of the foot. Okay, the leading edge of the arch. Totally different than the mid-tarsal break. There's just no comparison. And the fact that that point is lost on him indicates that he doesn't understand the biomechanics of the foot in the great apes and humans, period. No ifs, ands, or buts. Matt Crowley kind of took me to task and on the web has published a whole string of essays and so forth. And he went and made some of these rubber foot contrivances and went out in the sand and said, well, look, I can make a mid-tarsal pressure ridge too. See, here it is. Well, there's a whole series of discs here, but again, and the pressure ridge is starting way up here, much further forward. And if you look, he shows several pictures, so let's look at another one. Here's another one. Oh, look, here's a pressure ridge. So this looks like Dr. Meldrum's pressure ridge. But what happens if you put them side by side? They're in completely different places. They don't indicate the articulation of a joint, because obviously they're just rubber feet. And the placement of the disc is inconsistent from step to step. Which is not the case with the Sasquatch tracks. From independent cases, I've demonstrated pressure ridges that are in the appropriate position proportionately along the length of the foot to indicate that there is a rigid skeletal anatomy underlying the soft tissue that is responsible for this. So again, stick to what you're good at, and you can see this in this series, for example. You can see the heel start to show up here. Now again, there's the caveat that there's a little bit of topography right here that's obscuring some of the foot. But let's be real. You can see that the foot would be flat right about here. We can see part of the heel. Here, that portion of the heel is vertical, absolutely 90 degrees perpendicular vertical to the ground. If the foot wasn't bent at the midfoot, the toes would be sticking in the ground about 10 inches down here. But they're not. They're folded right underneath here. So this is, without any question, an example of mid-tarsal break. Okay, and then of course there's other examples. I've shown this from the tracks that I examined in 1996 outside of Walla Walla, Washington, the half tracks. Okay, you can quibble all you want if you want to hold on to those tired arguments, those indefensible arguments, but then how do you deal with the half tracks? How do you deal with a footprint that has no heel imprint whatsoever? that looks like this in the reconstruction of what's going on. Or this, as cast by Dennis Herrick, for example. This was out on my table. You can see the head and the base of the fifth metatarsal, one of the little long bones in the foot. And then this bulge is right here. That indicates the calcaneal-cuboid joint. If we overlap this half track with this footprint, it terminates right here, right in front of the position of the calcaneal-cuboid joint, which is part of the transverse tarsal joint. All right, my sounding too professorial here now, the too technical thing. So again, the half tracks, there's no way around them. Here's another one. This is from the Blue Mountains, from this same set of tracks that I documented. How do you explain this one? You know, the first one you might say, well, you know, it was too hard on the heel. This one's about 1.5 inches deep, and it's got a steep, sharp edge here. So there's no question that the heel is up in the air as this thing was running across this fallow field with the hay stubble in it. And then, of course, we can add finally the Bosberg tracks, examples of which were on the table. And one of the reasons it still is such a compelling example, even despite the association of Ivan Marx and the doubt that association may cast, the pall that it may cast. Ivan Marx, if you've seen his bakery, just get a hold of the In the Shadow of Bigfoot video, and it will convince you. Ivan Marx could never have concocted this. This has enthralled orthopedic surgeons and podiatrists that are very experienced and skilled, and so on. But basically what we're looking at here is a foot that is deformed. Since it's only present on one side, it's most likely the result of a crushing injury or even a neuropathy. One explanation was a spinal cord lesion could have caused this deformity to arise in the foot as the nerves innervating the lower extremity were affected by a growing tumor. But the point is that right here is the position of this back bunion. The only explanation for these two bunions is the derangement of these joints. So it indicates the position of the joint, which is, as Grover Krantz pointed out, is too far forward for it to be a human foot. The heel is much elongated and places that transverse tarsal joint in the very position that we've inferred it based on the mid-tarsal break and the pressure releases in the normal feet of the Sasquatch. So the corroboration from these several independent lines of evidence is just really overwhelming. And it all comes back to the Patterson-Gillen film and its implications. Now, one more nail in this argument, and that is I had the privilege of going to, at the expense of one's request, I had the privilege of going to China to examine some of the evidence for the Yeren. And this was really amazing. This gentleman is Mr. Yuan, and Mr. Yuan was part of the state-sponsored expeditions led by Zhou Gujing, who's been at the forefront of Yeren research for almost 4 decades now. He's in retirement. He's kind of stepping out of the limelight, and a number of amateur groups have stepped in to sort of fill in that gap. Mr. Yuan was in the Red Army at the time, and they had many Red Army enlisted men there to assist with the combing of the hillsides for evidence and interviews and so forth. He liked the area there in Hubei so well he stayed on and eventually became a park ranger. A number of years ago, as a park ranger, he was walking the patrol, came up to on one side of the head of a canyon, looked across about 100 yards to his side, and there on a boulder was this red hair-covered figure stretched out, sunning itself, apparently asleep. Couldn't quite tell what it was, he wasn't sure what it was, so he yelled at it, and it sat up and looked at him, slid off the rock, and walked into the trees on 2 legs. He followed it, went up around the head of the canyon, and followed after it, tracked it, found where it went to a water hole with a good loamy clay soil, and found very clear footprints, which he made casts of. And when they unveiled these, they wouldn't let me look at them until they had the cameras running, because they wanted to capture my initial reaction spontaneously. But I was awestruck, because this was amazing. It's a little, the lighting was kind of poor. We had the clouds that kind of rolled in. Did the best I could under the circumstances, but it something kind of helps. You can see there the profile. You can see that contour. It's remarkably similar to the Patterson-Gilman film site track, or that track that I had cast at the Blue Mountains. But here's what's telling. Look at the similarities. I mean, it's a dead ringer for the Titmus cast from the Patterson-Gilman film, right down to the pressure release right through here, the disposition of the toes. This individual's foot's a little bit broader, but they're represented there to the same scale. It was just measured just under 15 inches in length. So there is something in China, and this person had no idea about Sasquatch. He asked me, in fact, through the interpreter. He said, he said, do you have anything like the wild man, like the Yeren in the United States? And I said, well, maybe. As a matter of fact, that's kind of why we're here. Yeah. And then he saw a picture of this footprint, and he got very excited. Couldn't read the article, but the reprint, and he started thumping on this, pulling on my shirt sleeve, and I said, yes, I see, I understand. So something in China has feet that are absolutely identical to Sasquatch tracks in North America. What about the sole? Real quickly, there's been always a lot of talk about, well, why are the feet so white? They look fake. Well, this is grossly overexposed, the foot anyway. When any surface was oriented towards the sun, it lit up, and the margins then became rather inflated. It looks like big and puffy. There have been all sorts of silly statements made about that observation, ignoring all the other frames where you can see the sole of the foot very clearly, and the definition of the toes and the toe stems. I mean, it's just selective myopia, it really is. All you have to do is show a picture like this. These are photographs of a chimpanzee, and it looks identical. So is a chimpanzee wearing slippers from Kmart? Does it have sand stuck to the bottom of its feet? No. Does it have feet that are unusually white for an animal with a dark skin face? Well, no. It's the reflection of the light off of that smooth skin, and combined with in some instances, these animals that have exceptionally thick skin of the sole. That thick keratinized skin has a more opaque look to it than the melanin that's in the pigment. Pigment in the skin doesn't show through quite as well, but it's not extraordinary. It's not unusual. In fact, it's remarkably similar. There was someone who also made a comment about one time about the edge of the hair on the Sasquatch, the film subject being way too even and too much of the skin exposed on the sole of the foot. Well, again, they don't know what they're talking about, period. They haven't looked at apes. They don't know what the sole, the side. I mean, you can look at your own foot, and you can see the sole skin wraps up around, whether you have a lot of visible hair or not. There'll be hair follicles just above that, but the glabrous skin of the hairless skin of the sole of the foot wraps up on the side, let alone acknowledging the thicker sole pad of these animals. The heel, okay, they like to point, critics like to say, and Daglin is guilty of this again. He even made the ridiculous comments that this was such an inane effort to mimic anatomy that the perpetrators had attached the Achilles tendon forward from the edge of the heel. And he says that's just anatomically ridiculous. He's right, it would be anatomically ridiculous. The only thing that's more ridiculous is for him to have said it without having looked at the other frames where the Achilles tendon is taut and it comes straight off at the most distal or proximal end of the calcaneus bone. What happens is, because of that increased distance, here's the Achilles tendon, the calcaneal tendon, it attaches right back here on the tuberosity of the calcaneus. But because of the increased length of the calcaneus in the Sasquatch foot, to provide greater leverage in the shorter lever, this fulcrum is right here, to accommodate the mass of this big animal, the leverage is longer. So there's a greater length back here. And when that Achilles tendon relaxes, it slackens just a little bit, making the heel look more prominent. That large space behind the calcaneus makes for more of a hollow in front of the Achilles tendon. Here's the spookum cast. And this was one of the features that jumped out at me. That said, this isn't the forelimb of an elk. There's no hollow like that on the structure of an elk. But we've got this rounded heel, an Achilles tendon, a nice broad Achilles tendon, and this hollow that would have existed in front of the tendon between it and the tibia, where the skin kind of hugs the contour. This is Rick Knoll's heel, cast to show comparison, and it's remarkably consistent. So we've got this trend. Let me jump past this. We'll go. All right, the knee. This is really kind of interesting. Doug Hychek drew attention to what he called the wobble or the walleye, and unfortunately it was a little bit exaggerated in the DVD when Reuben Steindorf created the skeleton that was overlaid on the Sasquatch, the Patterson Gimlin film subject, under Doug's direction. He kind of exaggerated this movement of the knee, this wobble of the knee, which he called the walleye. But what was curious is recently, Dan Gibo, another colleague of mine, his wife and I were together at, we're on the faculty at Northwestern before I came to Pocatello. He teaches at Northern Illinois University. He described the ankle bone of one of the robust Australopithecines. And he came to the conclusion, based on his analysis, that this ankle was shaped kind of different, and that these paranthropines probably didn't walk exactly like modern humans. He said, in fact, they had kind of a wobble to their knee, where the knee would sort of flare out as they stepped and walked. Well, this was so close to the description of what Doug Hychek felt he was seeing very clearly. He contacted Dan and wanted him to comment to that effect in one of the documentaries. Dan initially agreed and was going to, and then about 3 weeks later called up and backed out. Decided it wasn't worth his time. He didn't want to take the time because after all, the film's fake and it would be silly to talk about it. Unfortunate. But once again, a feature of bipedalism that was observed in Patty that seemed a little unusual suddenly has precedent in the fossil record amongst early bipedal hominids. Okay, here's that skeletal reconstruction. Okay, then there's the herniation. Move on up. Doug drew attention to this. I had never really paid much attention to these details, but it was quite amazing. This is the before and after. Just as those the muscles of the quadriceps on the front of the thigh are flexing in order to begin to extend this the thigh on the knee, this bulge appears right there, very prominently, and it just pops out. And then it disappears after a little bit, once the muscle relaxes. Now, this can be the thigh beneath the skin and superficial fascia, or adipose, the fat under the skin. There is a very thick connective tissue layer called the fascia lata. That is the connective tissue covering around the muscles. And in the lower extremities, it's very, very thick, kind of like it's like support holes. It helps to create hydrostatic pressure that helps milk the blood back up towards the heart against gravity. As a result of a penetrating injury, or as a result of some infectious diseases like tuberculosis, the fascia can break down and have openings or holes that the muscle actually pops through, pushes through when it contracts, creates this herniation, quadriceps herniation. You can flip to any orthopedic text and read about this. I was describing this one time to one of my classes, my occupational physical therapy and anatomy classes, and this girl goes, oh, I have that. I said, oh, she says, yeah, right here. She said, put your hand right here. So she took a step, and right there, a ping pong ball-sized protrusion pops up under my hand. And it disappeared when she relaxed her leg, and when she put her weight on it, pops right through. You could see it just like a ping pong ball. So it was really quite amazing. The hand. Now this is a funny story, and it's a very telling story. There's a history to it. Many of the print images that you see of Patty are under the copyright of formerly Renee DeHinden and now his heirs, Eric and Martin. And the copy that Renee provided for these had a blemish on the film, which was right there on frame 352. Right there and right there. And for many years, a lot of people erroneously kept thinking that this was the fingers making kind of an okay sign. Like the fingers have these big long fingers wrapping around and meeting the thumb. They're not fingers at all. It's just a photographic blemish. If you go back to the original, and well, here's the close-up of it. So people have been interpreting this as fingers, and as a result, they think that Patty's kind of walking like an Egyptian, with the palm facing upward and backward. Okay. If you go to the keep getting ahead of myself. Bob Hieronymus, when everyone kept saying he walked like Patty did, and that's why he had to be the man in the pursuit. When Bob would walk with this kind of funny walk of his, he would turn his hand way back so the palm's facing backward. Why would he do that? He doesn't walk that way naturally. There are other film clips he's appeared on TV when he's walking to the bar, and he walks along just fine. But here especially, he's exaggerating. He's turning his palm back. Well, why? If we go to the original, or not to the original, but this is kind of an interesting story. This is a close-up of a 5x7 color print that I bought from Roger Patterson when I was in 5th grade, after I'd gone to the Spokane Coliseum. And I joined his Northwest Research Association, and I purchased an 11x14 black and white print and 5x7 color print. And it's probably one of the clearest, crispest prints of that film that's available. And so you zoom in, and there's no spot there. All you can see is the back of the hand. Right here, here's the wrist tapers right there, and then these are knuckles. Just like that. The hand, the fingers are curled in, the back of the hand is facing you as the arm swings. Not the palm side. You can't see anything of the fingers even on that hand whatsoever. But Bob doesn't know that. He's looking at the films he keeps seeing on TV or the stills that he keeps seeing in magazines. And so what does he do? He exaggerates by turning his hand and swinging it back and forth like an Egyptian. All right. How about the face? Well, there's been lots of different artistic renderings, and apparently there's this one frame that keeps circulating that gives the face this very Neanderthal look. That that single printed frame can't be reproduced from anything in the film. Owen Caddy has done a very extensive analysis of the face using frame-by-frame imagery, and there's no frame that matches that particular one upon which this image is based. Now, interestingly, when Roger was getting very sick and Ron Olson was taking the reins of the Northwest Research Association, he changed the name to the North American Wildlife Association. They popularized this artist's redrawing of the Patterson film. And it's kind of interesting when you look at the way they show the lower face. Nostrils facing straight forward, and the mouth kind of obscured by hair on the face here. Okay? Here's a close-up. This is the final result of at least a preliminary effort by Owen Caddy to illustrate what he sees through many successive frames. And it turns out it's not real easy because it was so hot on that sandbar. Well, it wasn't that hot. There was enough heat off the sandbar contrasting with the cool October air that there were convection currents apparently coming up that were causing some distortion in the imagery as recorded on the film. And so from frame to frame, the face kind of undulates a little bit because of these convection currents. But the main thing that Owen emphasized is that there were heavy lines in the face, that the nostrils were forward-facing, not a downward human-looking nose, and that the distance from the nose to the mouth was much greater than is given appreciation for otherwise. You know, he's got a muzzle, a mouth that has a lot of flexion lines, creases across it. Now, you know, we may quibble about details, but it's interesting that this is quite contrary. You know, when you actually look at the film and look at the details that emerge, they're very different. I should have stuck in here a picture of, well, and here we can compare it. So here's a blow-up of my 5x7. And you can see it's kind of going beyond, but you can see the dark spots there that he's interpreting as the nostrils. You know, and then this surface here that's quite broad, because it's catching the light. Okay, and you can see the reflection off of the cheekbone here. Some people ask me, what are these holes in the face? They're not holes, they're reflection of the light off of these smooth, hairless surfaces. Okay? All right. The other thing that he shows too, the outline of the jaw. He shows, and he emphasizes here as well, this feature that I've drawn some attention to, this protruding, what's called the gonial angle, the edge, the angle of the jaw out here, that clearly flares out considerably. I think I have, yeah. Now, here's an interesting correlation. This is not Gigantopithecus, but this is Australopithecus robustus, which, based on its dentition, was this big chewing machine like Gigantopithecus was. Hyper molarization of the molars and premolars, and diminutive canines that wore end to end, that were lined up with the small incisors across the front, and a very deep face relative to the remainder of its skull. But what's stunning is when you put this together and you line it up, I mean, point for point, chin, mouth, gonial angle, nasal aperture, zygomatic bone, orbits, brow ridge, peak up here. The proportions are remarkable. This animal had a chewing adaptation, and I'm not saying that Patty's an Australopithecine, but she had a chewing adaptation that was converged upon by both robust Australopithecines as well as Gigantopithecus, based on what we do know of its jaws and teeth. These massive, you can see the shadow right here. This shadow, the dark area, is the shadow of the masseter, the muscle that fills this huge area here. So heavy chewing apparatus. Okay. I was going to say something else, I can't remember. And I was gratified too. Bill Muntz had already stumbled kind of on this same sort of parallel. Here's one of his reconstructions of the robust Australopithecines, and he had lined it up with another profile view of Patty, and shown also that the facial proportions are remarkably convergent. All right, and finally, what about the stature? Well, there was one other thing. There was one other thing about the face that I wanted to mention. Oh, that was right, because it was suggested that Patty has a hairy face, and that no other eyewitnesses have described a hairy face. Well, I have to offer as an alternate observation that in my, let's see, 96, 12, my 13 years of not full-time, but rather preoccupied years of studying this, that I have interviewed witnesses that do describe a hairy face. One of the most credible eyewitnesses that I have spoken to, Julie Davis, whose story was recounted in the Denver Post by Theo Stein, had a very close encounter in southern Colorado. She was probably only 10 feet away from an 8-foot Sasquatch that was standing outside her tent as she emerged and turned around to look at it. And they locked eyes, and it was in broad daylight in the early afternoon. Locked eyes for probably 20, 30 seconds, which I'm sure felt like an eternity to her, before it turned and walked away. And she described its face, and she described short hair right up across the bridge of its nose. And I thought, well, that sounds kind of strange. I mean, it sounds an awful lot like a Wookiee or a Ewok or something. But then I reached up and I pulled down a book that had close-up photos of chimps and gorillas and orangutans. And despite the very hairless face of the chimpanzees, and to a lesser degree the gorillas, the orangutans had hair follicles with short hair right up across the bridge of the nose, right up underneath the eyes, up to the bags under the eyes. They were short hairs, but they were present and thick. So, and in this instance too, when the Sasquatch walked away, as it walked towards the tree line, it turned and looked back at her and then cocked its head and whistled before it disappeared into the trees. So, there are multiple witnesses in which the subject has turned and looked back upon retreating in a fashion very similar to what Patty did. Okay, finally, this is the icing on the cake, really, is stature. So very quickly, Grover struggled with this because using this image, and this is actually a slide from Grover's files that I inherited upon his passing, he used this length of the foot, assuming that it was about 14.5 inches. And he said he could only fit, no matter what he tried, he could only fit about, or less than 5 lengths of the foot. And so he kept coming up with a height that was somewhere between 6 and 6.5 feet, but no higher than that, no taller than that. Well, the problem is, this is a lousy frame to choose. He chose it because the foot appears almost perpendicular, so there would be no foreshortening of the foot. It would be a true length that's projected parallel to the film frame. But the problem is it's way overexposed. You can't see any of the detail of the toes, and so the margins are probably way off on this. Plus in this frame, the foot, the individual is quite hunched. Now there's some other frames you could choose from. Now, although the precision is probably going to drop off a little bit, but these are some of the frames at the very end of the film, when the subject is moving away from Roger and disappearing, just about to disappear around another big crow's nest. If you take one of these and approximate a length, you can easily get, how many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 5 in there fairly comfortably. But all this really is moot because there's much more precise ways to get at this. And one of these was accomplished with a certain degree of success by Jeff Whitman when he was leading NASA, and he took a picture. Whoop, that's all right. He took a picture that had been taken. He utilized a picture that had been taken by Peter Byrne of Al Hodgson's son standing at the site with a measuring stick. Al Hodgson's son stands 6 foot 2 inches tall. And with that frame, he was able to superimpose objects in the foreground and background, and to his satisfaction, line them up pretty well. And then superimposed additional frames with Patty in the picture. And clearly, she's much taller than 6 foot 2, and in fact, he came up with a height rather of 7 foot, 7 foot 3 and 3/4 inches, is what it was. But also impressive is the girth, the mass of this being compared to this 6 foot 2 young man. And very quickly, what he did is, using photogrammetric techniques and modern computer software, he mapped the two-dimensional landmarks from individual film frames, and then allowed the computer to take those, calculate their relationships, how they were varying with slightly different perspectives, and from that generate a three-dimensional model. But there's certain assumptions that have to be programmed in, such as the focal length of the lens, the distances roughly between some of the subjects. He utilized for those distances the measurements that were taken by John Green and Bob Tibbets individually at the site. What he found was, though, is the model kept falling short of a satisfactory resolution, especially out at the edges. It just wasn't quite working out. Now, and this kind of this segues into one of the other comments that we made earlier this afternoon. If you've ever been to the site, you find that it's a pretty narrow little spot. The whole creek bed itself isn't much wider than this auditorium. The creek kind of wanders through it, and then from that point, the sides of the valley are extremely steep, and in places they are precipitous. In fact, that was one of the ways that Bob knew roughly where he was at, because he had a very distinct recollection of riding his horse across a creek and past a very steep cliff that was vertical. When you see the film, especially when you do see the whole panorama, as has been suggested, and not just the zoomed-in, cropped, and blocked images and frames, you have a sense of a much wider open space. Now, you get some sense of this, of these relationships if you look at Meet the Sasquatch. Chris Murphy has done some great work recreating dioramas to try to depict the three-dimensional space. But Patty is somewhat constrained. Her course of retreat is either head for the trees, which seems to be the logical, but then what happens? You're not in the forest, you're on a mountainside that goes up almost vertically. So you're going to be completely exposed to view for quite some time until you get deeper into the timber. But you can go upstream, go through this little, around this crow's nest and through this choke point in the canyon, and then the walls break down. And from there, she took a path of least resistance of a much more gentle grade that took her right up the mountainside and out of the canyon. So her behavior wasn't that unnatural, I don't think. Having been at the site and seen what her choices were, she had no way of knowing what was behind Roger and Bob, so she would naturally retreat away from them upstream and going up the canyon rather than trying to navigate straight up the walls immediately. And there's the third variable that hasn't been mentioned. When her tracks were first seen a month earlier on the Blue Creek Mountain and Onion Mountain roads, when Al Hodgson called John Green and Renee McGinnon to come down and investigate, and once they had left, he called Roger to let him know there were 3 sets of tracks. And Roger and Bob talk about this. They thought this was probably the middle-sized one. I mean, since it was a female, there were 3. They thought maybe there was a bigger male. In reality, what they were looking at was the larger of the 3 tracks. There were 15-inch, 13-inch, and 11-inch. But they were aware of that. Now, where were those other 2? Those potential juveniles? Were they with her somewhere? No one has ever seen their footprints. No one had ever seen their footprints on the sandbar. Bob Titmus looked specifically for that and didn't find any sign of them being nearby. But maybe they were up on the ridge. And so the last thing she wants to do is to lead these 2 intruders directly back to her juveniles. She would lead them some other direction, away from those perhaps. Just a thought. You know, the point is, who's to say what's natural and unnatural behavior? Okay? So how many anomalies have I knocked down so far? 2, 3? Well, anyway, hairless face, looking back, unnatural behavior, female. There have been lots of reports of female. In the Blue Mountains, we've gotten lots of eyewitness accounts describing the presence of breasts and females carrying infants on their hips or on the back. So all of those things, I think, are not cause for concern. The timeline still has some vexing details that are troublesome. I would contest the allegation that Palo Alto was the only place that the film could be developed. Others have looked into that question and identified a number of other places where DAP could have had the film processed. In fact, one of the possible explanations for his reluctance to tell why is because he may have been doing it after hours at a company where he didn't have the approval to use their equipment, or have someone else use their equipment, and didn't want to get someone in trouble. And it wasn't posted by the mail, it was almost certainly sent via air carrier from the Eureka Arcata Airport, not the post office. The airport's open all night long. And quite honestly, I don't know how well Al remembers. In fact, I've got a videotape, about 45 minutes of videotape of Al Hodgson recalling his experiences with Roger upon his first meeting. I haven't looked at it for about 9 years. I'll go back and review that and see if he says anything about the timeline when Roger arrived. But quite honestly, depending on when he was queried about that particular time, Al is a very nice guy, but he's getting old and he forgets a lot of details, and he admits that he can't remember all the details of what happened almost 40 years ago. So, anyway, finally, last thing, and then I'll clap for you because you waited so long to get the explanations. Bill Munns executed this photogrammetric analysis. It wasn't working. What I was trying to say is, if you've ever been to the site, it's very constrained, and yet when you look at the film, it feels wide open. It feels like this big stage, this big broad stage, and you know, where Patty's sort of lost in the middle of it, it seems. Well, it turns out that he went back and he checked the specs for the camera, looked in the manual, and sure enough, it comes with a standard accessory 15mm lens. He had assumed it was a 25, which he had been so informed. 25mm lens, but a 15mm lens is a wide-angle panoramic lens, which is preferable for scenery shots. For wide angle, he plugged in the 15mm value into the formulation, and the computer checked through the calculations, and boom, his three-dimensional model fit perfectly. Resolved the inconsistency. Well, the implication of that was huge, though, because not only did it solve his problem in creating a three-dimensional model, but with that value, all he has to do is plug into a very simple optical relationship to calculate the height of the film subject. If you know the height of the subject of interest on the film itself, the film frame, you know the focal length, you know the approximate distance between the cameraman and the subject, then you can solve for the proportionality of the film subject itself. In so doing, he came up with this one. 7 feet 4 inches tall, right on the mark that NASA had come up with based on their forensic overlay approach. 7 feet 4 inches tall. And Yakima, when he presented this publicly for the first time, he basically said, you know, this is completely changing the tenor of the discussion. No more, and this is what I tried to hammer home to the audience, no more can someone get out there or publicly say that's just a man in a fur suit and have any credibility whatsoever. As soon as they make any allusion to that statement, you can just write them off, because it's not just a man in a fur suit. If it is any kind of man in a fur suit, it's a 7 foot 4 inch tall man in 1967, wearing a custom designed suit that in another separate essay, Bill Munns completely takes apart as impossible, essentially, virtually impossible that someone would have constructed a suit in 1967 with the fabrics and materials that were available at that time and created that image that you saw. So as soon as this stuff starts getting published, he has papers lined up with several technical journals and trade magazines, elaborating on his methodology and analysis and inviting others to replicate it and to critique it. It's going to be really amazing. It's going to be really amazing. I mean, for me, just the footprints alone are convincing. But now when you put this whole package together, it creates a really stunning affirmation of the Patterson-Gimlin film as the most significant photographic evidence for the existence of Sasquatch. Thank you very, very much.